Our gospel reading today comes from Mark's gospel. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared with them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The word of the Lord. Good morning. My name is Peter. Simon Peter, to be exact. Oh, I know y'all were expecting that cute little southern girl to be up here talking to y'all this morning. And I must admit, she is pretty good. But today you are lucky. You have me, Simon Peter, one of Jesus' actual disciples. And to be really honest, I was his favorite. Oh, I know you probably heard that it was John that Jesus liked best. Oh, John, the beloved disciple. And it's true, John was, how do you say, a brown noser a little bit. Anyhow, I was asked to come today to give you the keys to the kingdom. Oh, all right, God, I get it. All right, God is telling me to stop using that old tired joke and to make sure y'all know that salvation doesn't work like that. But Jesus did say I was the rock on which he would build that church. Y'all want to be on my good side, I'm just saying. Now, I don't get to come down here all that often. I do have an important job, you know, in heaven. I'm the gatekeeper. I get to decide who comes in and who gets... Okay. God says to tell you that salvation doesn't work like that. There's no gate, and God is enough for everyone. Jeez. God is really getting testy. All these so-called religious folks slinging his divine name around, using it to scare people, oppress people, using God's name to justify their hoarding and neglect of their neighbors in need. I mean, it is a little bit confusing how so many Christians actually live as if Jesus taught believing the right way would bring about a windfall of material wealth, when Jesus actually taught that it's harder for a rich man to get into the kingdom of God than for a camel to travel through the eye of a needle. And if you want to try and rationalize that, I tell you, he actually did tell that rich young ruler that he had to sell everything if he wanted to inherit the kingdom. You ought to have seen that young man's face. It was like he just got some terminal news. God has lost a good bit of her sense of humor, if you ask me. God doesn't like his children being hurt, especially when it's from a distortion of his word. Which brings me to why I'm here today. The Transfiguration. And there can be a lot of misunderstanding about this story. It's a weird one at best, and people have struggled to make sense of it for several centuries now. And Mark, in his no-nonsense way of telling the story, doesn't unpack it entirely well. Of course, he wasn't there. So let me tell you what happened. When the rabbi asked us to follow him up the mountain, you can bet we were all excited. James and I were pretty exhausted from all of the traveling, all of the crowds, and my goodness, all of the miracles. We saw some amazing things happen traveling around with Jesus. From feeding over 5,000 folks with just a couple of fish and 5 loaves, to healing a paralyzed man, to actually watching him speak to demons, and the demons obeyed him. A lot happened over the past few years traveling the countryside, and a getaway from it all was just what we needed. Now, if I'm going to be honest, and, well, why shouldn't I be? I've already made it past the pearly gates. The week before Jesus invited us up the mountain, he was kind of freaking us out a bit. To be fair, the Master always did speak in code, or parables, as he liked to call them. It was enough to make you want to strangle him. And the way he answered a question with a question, frustrating. But even after years of stories of the sowers and seeds and lamps and bushel baskets, this new emphasis on suffering and rejection and death was, well, it was unsettling. Making our way to Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asked us, "Who do people say that I am?" Well, old Nathanael popped up, "John the Baptist." And then Andrew said, "Some people think that you are Elijah returned to earth." I'm the one who answered correctly. Peter. I said, "You Messiah." Now, I don't know how classroom etiquette happens in the here and now, but back then when you gave a right answer, you got a little praise. But I didn't get a "Good job, Peter." I didn't get a "That's right, Peter." I didn't even get a "Attaboy, Peter." I got a "Be quiet, Peter." And if that wasn't strange enough, Jesus began to tell us that the Son of Man, now that's what he liked to call himself sometimes, I think it was to make sure that he knew he was really one of us, was headed for great suffering and rejection, that he would be killed and in 3 days would rise again. Y'all, it was some nonsense. After all, this was the Messiah. He couldn't suffer and die. God had anointed him to fully restore us, God's people, to our rightful place in power. How could Jesus lead us to overthrow the Roman Empire if he was dead? I thought maybe he was just testing us. You know, if we were really listening. And truth is, one more agricultural metaphor and our eyes probably would have glossed over. But he wasn't testing us. I pulled him off to the side and told him to stop all this crazy talk. And do you know what he did? He told me to stop letting my fear dictate my responses. That my fear was keeping me from seeing God's big picture. Now, this did hurt my feelings a little bit. I mean, he might as well called me Satan and told me to get behind him. Now, I didn't have any time to pout before Jesus took this message of suffering to the crowds. As we stood there among the people, he began to teach, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and pick up their cross. For those who want to save their lives will lose it, and those who lose their lives for my sake and the sake of the gospel will save it." The confused looks, the raised eyebrows, oh, we would have given for a nice little good mustard seed parable about then. Now, we didn't have marketing classes back then, but Jesus could have used one. So 6 days later, when the Master asked us to follow him up the mountain, we gladly obliged. A little R was indeed what we needed. So as James, John, and I stopped to wipe our brow near the top, Jesus walked on ahead of us, and there he was transfigured. His clothes shimmered, glistening white, whiter than any bleach could make them. Elijah, along with Moses, came into view in deep conversation with Jesus. You can imagine, we were terrified. Jesus had been trying to get us to understand all along, but we just didn't get it. Now, don't be misled. Jesus didn't turn into something different than who he already was, but rather, for the first time, he was fully revealed to us. Son of Man and God's beloved. Man and then some. The light bulb, at least for a moment, went off, and we saw our Master for all of who he was. The walking, talking, law and prophetic presence of our God. You see, what happened up on that mountain wasn't only for Jesus, but for us. It's Jesus talking with Moses, the giver of the law, and Elijah, the greatest prophet, and for this brief second on earth, this is my son. Listen to him. Now, we didn't have a whole lot of time to process all this glory before Jesus was ushering us back down the mountain, back to the crowds, back to the predictions and rejection, on our way to Jerusalem. So over the next few months, as we traveled toward the holy city, we listened as Jesus told more stories that turned everything we thought we knew upside down. That money doesn't save us. That all of God's laws could be summed up by saying, love God and love neighbor. And that if we want to be first, we must first choose to be last. It, how do you say, rocked our world. Y'all get what I did there? I'm the rock. Rocked our world. You get that? Now that I think about it, it's as if Jesus knew we would need something to help us see beyond the suffering that lay ahead. It's as if he was allowing us to glimpse the promise being fulfilled. Because Jesus knew that living into God's will of unconditional love would bring him directly in opposition with all those who had received their places of power through intimidation and fear. He knew these powers would be so threatened that they wouldn't stop until they killed him. Looking back, he was only trying to prepare us for what would happen to him and what might also happen to us should we choose to follow. Now, have y'all heard of Bishop Oscar Romero? Yeah, that's good. Sometimes I have to ask. Sometimes people in North America lately seem a little oblivious to what's happening in the rest of God's creation. Well, anyway, good old Oscar, who I have to tell you is a sweet, sweet fellow, he really trusted the transfiguration. When folks choose between living out the gospel or living to save his life, good old Oscar, he chose the gospel. In a sermon delivered only 3 weeks before his assassination by government forces, he reflected, the theology of the transfiguration is saying that the road of redemption passes through the cross at Calvary, but that the goal of Christians is beyond history. Not to alienate himself from history, but rather to give more meaning to history, a definitive meaning. Sitting by that fire, watching the soldiers arrest and mock Jesus, I denied him. Not once, but 3 times. I know, not my best moment. But it was remembering Jesus up on that mountaintop in all his splendor and glory that gave me the strength to finally stop hiding. We were given a foretaste of God's eternal power, and because of it, I was able to trust that I too would one day stand with Moses and Elijah, and that nothing the Roman Empire could do to stop that from happening. Can you believe that to this day I still call Elijah my friend, even though he likes to tell people that I wet myself when he showed up on that mountain? Now, I'm not here to give you any answers. If Jesus taught us anything, it was that answers tend to help people dig their heels in sand and draw lines to keep some in and some out, while stories invite everyone to the table and invite transformation. But rather, I'm here to remind you that 1, well, I was Jesus' favorite. Don't forget that. And 2, the transfiguration is not something so much for us to fully understand, but to grow, to learn, to trust. One that helps us recognize Jesus and remember Jesus for all of who he is. God most fully revealed in human form, and the one who points us to a God who can redeem and can save no matter what. It is in this trust that we find the courage to head back down the mountain, or in this case, back out through these doors, to be a living testament to hope in an ever-increasing polarized environment, to speak truth when truth seems so easily malleable these days, and to love when so much of our world has forgotten how. It is time for us to shine, my friends, dazzling white, so bright that no bleach can make it whiter. We weren't sure what we would face when we came down the mountain that day. We couldn't even have fathomed what we face heading into Jerusalem. But we were learning to trust who the one was walking with us. And so we trusted and chose to follow. Will you?